unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha. I'm your host, Milan of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We've had a flurry of activity over the past week from the continuing fallout of recent tensions between India and Pakistan, a rash of coalition announcements from both the Congress and the BJP, and a series of testy exchanges between the government and the opposition on the question of corruption. I'm recording today from Mumbai, where I'm pleased to be joined by my good friend Reuben Abraham, CEO and Senior Fellow of the IDFC Institute, to talk about the latest developments on the Indian political scene. Reuben, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you very much.
So I want to begin by asking you about the issue of corruption. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has famously said that he's the nation's chokidar, right, the watchman, standing guard to protect the country, from threats at home and abroad. Rahul Gandhi has tried to attack the Prime Minister by harping on these corruption allegations stemming from the Rafale fighter jet deal, saying that chokidar chor hai, right, that the watchman is a thief, that he's in on the take. This week, the Prime Minister has counterpunched, responding aggressively with a new campaign slogan, basically saying, I'm a watchman, right, and making that a hashtag, and everyone is retweeting that. My question is this: what salience do you think corruption actually has in this election? Is this a place where realistically the opposition can land a punch?
Sure. So I think, first of all, I think Narendra Modi is a master of turning a phrase to his advantage. So I think this is the chokidar argument is very similar to the way he turned chaiwala around, right? And so he's basically turning chokidar around to his advantage. So, it's a masterclass in political communication. But on the question that you're asking, I think there's many things that you can accuse Narendra Modi of, but corruption is probably the one thing that is not going to stick, because I think by and large people in India, whatever the objections to Modi, I don't think too many people accuse him of corruption. So I personally am a little puzzled by why the Congress is using this particular tack to address him. I am told that the internal polling data shows that it actually has salience. I haven't seen this data, but certainly based on my conversations, admittedly all of them are anecdotal, with my driver, people who I work with, etc. Do they really care about Rafale? Not really. I don't think Rafale really registered at all. So I am genuinely puzzled that the opposition is using corruption as the tack to go after Mr. Modi when unemployment, jobs, etc. are available, where there's deep crises. So, again, if I was the opposition, I would be focusing on jobs, unemployment, and distress in rural areas.
And sort of, what is the likelihood that this actually backfires on the Congress, right? Because if you keep lodging corruption allegations against Modi, he turns around and says, well, look at UPA2. You had Colgate, you had 2G, you had CWG. Is that a real danger that essentially explodes in their face?
So I'm not sure how far back public memory goes, but it's entirely possible that it's possible to revive public memory to remind people that there were these really massive scams during UPA2. So is there a likelihood that it could blow up in their faces? Yes. Again, as I said, Yashwant Sinha made this point in relation to national security. The whole idea of going on to Mr. Modi's strongest areas and attacking him, to me, doesn't make any sense, because he's definitely going to counterpunch. And when he counterpunches, it's likely he'll win.
So I want to switch topics here and talk about the sort of flurry of activity we've seen on the coalition front. So the BJP has recently stitched up alliances across the Northeast, in Tamil Nadu, Bihar, Maharashtra, and elsewhere. The Congress has sort of not quite kept up pace, but they've announced at least initial deals in a few states, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Jharkhand, Karnataka. After the 2014 election, many analysts were sort of downplaying the importance of alliance politics, right? You had the first single-party majority in 3 decades. Are we seeing some kind of return to coalition politics? Is this kind of essentially kind of a reversion to the mean?
Yes, I strongly agree with that statement. I think it's reversion to the mean, because I think you should never expect presidential outcomes in a parliamentary democracy. And what you really had in 2014 was a sort of presidential outcome, right? A single figure winning a massive majority and so on and so forth. And it's very easy to sort of get carried away with that. And so I mean, I think the way Indian elections play out is that it's fought at a constituency by constituency, state by state basis, not at the national level. So therefore, the arithmetic at the constituency level is really what is going to swing the election. So I think effectively what you have is 545 individual elections that are happening. And so they've got to be won seat by seat. And that's the way India has been. And so 2014 to me was really the anomaly, not a pattern, a new pattern emerging, if you will. So I think what you're going to see in this election is, yes, we're going to go back to this mode where regional parties become dominant once again. And the most likely outcome of the election, one way or another, is a coalition.
So you don't buy the argument that people make saying, look, we've kind of entered a new era where, we have a political talent like Narendra Modi, who is something we haven't seen since maybe Indira Gandhi in terms of his ability to just sort of saturate the political space, right? And so therefore, the kind of old rules of political gravity don't really apply because he has been able to successfully presidentialize the system in such a way. De facto, right?
Yeah, but let's just work through the arithmetic of this, right? I mean, so he won 25 out of 25 seats in Rajasthan. He won 72, 73 seats in Uttar Pradesh.
Correct.
I mean, in all the big states that matter to them, so Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Gujarat, they've maxed out.
Right.
So I don't care how much of a leader Mr. Modi is. The fact is, he is maxed out. And the only way, say, Rajasthan can go is for the BJP to lose seats.
That's right.
So the real question is, where are they making up? And it's not clear to me that a deficit in, say, a potential deficit rather, in, say, Uttar Pradesh can be made up in the Northeast, right? Which is where they're betting on. There's just not enough seats.
Right.
Now, the place where they could potentially make up is the South, but I don't see any sign of the BJP's sort of reemergence in the South, if you will, or emergence in the South. To your previous question, I think there's two things to point out on the alliance side.
Yeah.
One is obviously the BJP has assembled a cash hoard, which is unlike anything else that has ever been seen in Indian elections. So they start with this massive advantage. The second thing, interestingly enough, for a party that has that kind of cash hoard, they've actually been awesomely accommodating of allies in ways that I actually see the Congress not doing. Right. So if you look at the way the BJP has accommodated the Shiv Sena in Maharashtra by actually giving them a large chunk of seats versus, say, the Congress strategy in Delhi, where they're refusing to ally with the Aam Aadmi Party. So to me, in effect, they've just basically handed over 7 seats in Delhi to the BJP. Just doesn't make any sense why the BJP, which is the dominant party here, is actually being more accommodating than the Congress.
Yeah, I mean, same in Bihar.
Same in Bihar, same in
50-50 to Nitish.
Yeah.
You mentioned the South, and I want to circle back to that because you come from Kerala.
Yeah.
You've spent many years living and working in Hyderabad. You now call Mumbai home. Having spent, a week in Delhi, I was really struck, in every political conversation I had, the sort of absence of anything, from the Southern Peninsula and a sort of single-minded obsession with kind of Hindi heartland politics.
Yes.
So, the question to you, which sounds very obvious, is, why is this the case? Is there just a different political conversation happening in the South with different political issues? Are there differences in sort of what's salient? I mean, how do you see this?
Yeah, so, I mean, the obvious answer is geographically where is Delhi located, right? I mean, Delhi is located far north, and so therefore the concerns of Delhi are going to be that of the areas around Delhi, right? Not of the South. Now, the important thing to note here, though, is if you say, for instance, remember the 2004 elections. The 2004 elections was not lost by the BJP in the Hindi heartland. It was won by the Congress in Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, and Maharashtra, right? One mustn't forget those lessons. So I think those alliance exercises in the South actually matter a great deal. So you should be paying a lot more attention to the South. But, so there's also the other set of issues, which is, in general, because of the Delhi centricity of the Indian establishment, there's a whole range of issues that go missing, right? I mean, you can start with on the strategic front. I mean, how important is maritime to India? I mean, India basically has this completely land-based conversation when, in fact, we're the only country to have an ocean named after us. So shouldn't the conversation really be maritime, because we are actually a maritime civilization, have one of the largest coastlines in the world, but we end up in a scenario where we name our aircraft carrier after a North Indian emperor who never saw the ocean, the Vikramaditya, right? So yeah, I mean, it's just a bias. It's built in. But I think the important lesson is that 2004, 2009 was about alliances in the South, not about winning the Hindi heartland.
And that's a corrective to the conventional wisdom that you often hear that, 2004 was about the BJP's tone-deaf India Shining campaign, right? I mean, you and others have written that if you have a few differences in the performance in a couple of South Indian states, you could have had a very different outcome.
Absolutely. So, I mean, in 2004, for instance, I mean, just think of a world in which the Congress would have stayed with its regular Tamil Nadu ally, which is the AIDMK. You would have had a completely different outcome. I mean, there would have been many, many seats short, the alliance. Similarly, I mean, you had Chandrababu Naidu basically losing the election to YSR. I think in general, what happens in all of these cases is that the narrative gets far ahead of the data, right? I mean, so the whole idea that the India Shining narrative is what cost the BJP the election. I mean, I have never understood on what basis that narrative built up, because I don't see any data to sort of back it up. So similarly, Chandrababu Naidu losing the election because he focused on urban areas, not on rural, again, doesn't back up. It's not backed up by data, because the fact of the matter is he actually lost all his urban seats as well. So there's something else at work. So, I'm not necessarily saying that I know why Chandrababu Naidu lost the AP election, but certainly you can get to falsification, which is, the existing narrative certainly has problems.
Now, what about the Indo-Pakistan tensions? Do you think that that's something that's going to have the same kind of resonance in South India as it seems to be having, at least now, lock and change in 6 weeks, having in North India?
No, certainly not. I mean, I just was in the South, and I didn't see the sort of conversations there that I see in the northern part of the country. So in general, the Indo-Pak issue has less salience in the South. I mean, in the South, the concerns are very different. It's much more maritime, if you will. Does the Indo-Pak issue have the same salience? Certainly not the same salience, but all of this could be upset if there is, say, another incident,
right,
and a powerful response from the Modi government. Yeah, I mean, in the immediate aftermath of an incident, it becomes a national issue for sure. But once you play it out over, say, the next 6 weeks, will it remain as much of an issue in the South? I'm not sure.
So, one issue we're not really talking about in terms of the political conversation in India right now, it's sort of become a sideshow, is this issue of inequality between states, right? So there's growing disquiet among southern states that we're putting more into the kitty in terms of revenues than we're getting out in terms of fiscal transfers. When it comes to political representation, however, the North is the one who's saying, look, we're badly underrepresented because population growth has been slowing in the South, and so we actually deserve more seats. The situation, there's a lot of malapportionment. There's concerns about migration, a lot of northern migration to the southern states, which is putting pressure on labor markets. Even if this is not an immediate electoral issue, how do you think, how concerned do you think we should be about this in terms of how Indian federalism kind of looks out into the future?
So, I mean, clearly this is a powder keg, right, with no easy answers. And in many ways, the reason why it has not blown up thus far is actually because most people don't know the underlying issues. So the fact that the census is frozen to 1971 levels, none of this is actually well known or widely known to the Indian public. So one sort of thing that may happen come 2025, 2026 is that they decide to kick the can even further down the road.
Correct.
Right? So you just basically avoid the problem completely. But given that both are legitimate requests, right? So the South should not be punished for performing well. And at the same time, India is a proportional democracy, so therefore the North should not be punished by way of having fewer representatives for a given population level. So how do you basically reconcile these two is really the central issue. So in my opinion, I don't see any way you actually reconcile this unless you have a true federal system right? So you take away the unitary bias, if you will. So the way you take away the unitary bias could be, for instance, scrapping the concurrent list, right? I mean, that's one way you could do it. But you've got to get rid of the unitary bias so that we actually become a true union of states. And then if you want to expand the strength of the Lok Sabha, then almost by definition, you have to restructure the Rajya Sabha. And so the Rajya Sabha has to look much more like the US Senate,
Right.
So that it actually represents the rights of the states that have done well, control their population, are doing well economically, but may find that their political voice in the Lok Sabha is beginning to shrink.
Right. So it essentially offsets whatever impact you might have
Absolutely.
by changing representation of
Yes,
Lok Sabha.
yes.
Because right now, the argument I've made, it's not a novel argument, is that the Rajya Sabha is supposed to be the House of States,
Yes.
representing state interests, and it really doesn't serve that function.
It doesn't. And then, so structurally, you've also got to think in terms of now what are we talking about? So the US Senate has statewide elections, right? I mean, that's not how the Rajya Sabha is chosen. So are we now saying that we need elections into the Rajya Sabha? Do Tripura and Maharashtra get the same number of seats?
Right.
So one has to think through a bunch of these issues. But if you don't find a way to recompense one way or another, right? I mean, so if you're going to continue with the existing system, which ends up hurting the North Indian states, then you've got to find a way to recompense that. Or if you're going to change the system in a way that the southern states get badly hit, then you've got to. But I think some of the stuff, certainly on the fiscal side, can probably be done algorithmically. I mean, you just have to figure a way in which the transfers happen. But the larger question of how does one structure it politically, there are no easy answers.
So I want to end this session, as we do every week, by asking you to share with some of our listeners, one story coming out of India that you think we're not sufficiently paying attention to, but sort of caught your attention.
So it's not a major story, but I was intrigued by this particular story, which is in Andhra Pradesh. Y.S. Jagan Reddy's uncle was murdered in cold blood. Now, if you know the politics of Andhra Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh is in some ways the Badlands of South India, if you will, right? And so,
particularly the part that
the
family
family is from, and the family has a bloody history, right? I mean, Jagan's grandfather was murdered in a very similar sort of manner. They, equally, their opponents were also killed. So it's curious to me as to what is going on here, right? I mean, is it a revival of that, ultra-violent cycle of politics in Andhra Pradesh? I don't know. I mean, it could also be, much more simple sort of score settling at the local level. But it was a story that certainly caught my attention because I know the past of the sort of that region that they hail from.
Yeah, so the timing obviously is...
The timing is obviously suspect because the elections are coming in April.
So one story that caught my attention is it looks like India is finally going to have its first Lokpal. In 2013, Parliament passed the Lokpal bill to create a sort of national anti-corruption ombudsperson, and this, of course, was the outgrowth of the Anna Hazare anti-corruption protests, which led to the rise of Arvind Kejriwal and the Aam Aadmi Party and so on and so forth. But for the past 5 years, we've seen no movement on this front, and I think it's partially a reflection of the Modi government's relative lack of interest in creating this layer of the bureaucracy, but also the opposition, I think, has been playing hardball in terms of coming to the table and actually having serious talks. So that's something that whoever comes to power in 2019 is going to have to reckon with. Who do you think had the best week in Indian politics or in India?
So the best week certainly is more than likely Prime Minister Modi, because I think post December he was definitely uncomfortable, and I think post Pulwama and the sort of sentiment, the nationalist sentiment in the wake of the attack and the airstrikes, has definitely favored him. Also, their ability to sew up alliances, which I thought would be much harder. So, for instance, say the alliance with the Shiv Sena in Maharashtra, the fact that they basically put it together in very quick time, all of that basically suggests to me that Modi, the Prime Minister, has had a very good week.
So, Reuben, I want to end by asking you, who do you think had the worst week in India this week?
Well, as a resident of Mumbai, I think the city of Mumbai probably had the worst week. We had yet another foot-over bridge collapse, which led to the loss of, I think, 6 people were killed. And, this just doesn't seem to go away, which is the terrible sort of infrastructure mess that Mumbai has. And it's astounding almost that a city that generates as much wealth as it does gets stuck with such poor infrastructure. And every time something like this happens, there's always a promise to clean up and so on. And then you just sit and wait until the next infrastructure breakdown happens. So I certainly hope, perhaps wistfully, that this is the wake-up call and that people will start doing something about the infrastructure and they take the audits of the existing infrastructure much more seriously and so on and so forth.
So it's not a very uplifting note on which to end, but nonetheless, we're happy to have you. Reuben, thanks for coming on the show and look forward to talking to you soon.
Thank you very much.
So my guest on the podcast today is Ruchir Sharma. He is one of the most sought-after commentators on the global economy. He's also an accomplished writer. In addition to his job as a contributing columnist at the New York Times, Ruchir has written 3 books: Breakout Nations, published in 2012, The Rise and Fall of Nations, which was a 2016 New York Times bestseller. His latest book, published just a few months ago, is titled Democracy on the Road, a 25-year journey through India. I'm very excited to have him on the podcast today. Thank you for coming on, Ruchir.
Thanks, Milan. Great to sort of connect with you.
So I'm guessing that you get this question a lot, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I think it's one of the first questions a lot of readers of your book or potential readers are going to have, which is, you are a senior executive at one of the biggest investment banks on the planet. What's a guy like you doing spending so much time on the campaign trail in India?
Well, first, I guess everyone's allowed to have a hobby. So this has been my hobby and passion, which sort of dates back to the fact that I've been a writer for longer than I've been an investor. I've always had a keen interest in what's happening in the political scene back in India, and I started my interest in this formed at an early age, as I sort of detail in the book. I've taken a week out every year to do this. I guess, for a hobby, that's not that much of time commitment. But more than that, it's a complete personal initiative to understand India better and to sort of do that with a bunch of, I think, pretty smart and informed people. The other point, which I do feel is a bit sort of strange, in this question, is the fact that there's almost this feeling in India that if you're in the world of business or anything to do with finance, you've got to keep out of politics. And as you know, that's very different in the United States. In the United States, the leading CEOs or executives openly talk about their political inclinations. They do fundraisers. They donate openly. They openly tell you if they're Democrat or Republican. So I feel that this is a bit of hypocrisy about the fact that if you're in this, that the two things should be kept separate. Also the fact that I feel there's a real element of fear, that if you're in business in India, given the overreach of government, that you better not say anything regarding politics or the government. So I assume that's where this question comes from.
I want to rewind a little bit because the book is really about these regular interactions you've had on the campaign trail, and they really began when you were just a young boy at the age of 5. You attended a rally for Indira Gandhi in Bijnor in Uttar Pradesh, where your family stays. Your summers there in Bijnor left, I think, what seems like from the book, an indelible mark on you. And after a long while away, you returned back in 2018, and it was interesting to read. You seem to have found less change than you were hoping for back home in Uttar Pradesh. What did you find when you went back, and how did it compare to your kind of childhood summers?
Yeah, so I went back, as you know, to write the closing chapter of the book because that's where it all began. And so one of my favorite lines in the book that I sort of mention out there is the fact that changes upon changes, India can feel more or less the same. So to me, it was very instructive about the fact that this 160-kilometer journey to east of Delhi took the same time that it took me 30 years ago when we'd go on those summer vacations to Bijnor. But beneath the change, beneath this constant sort of time, I think, is the fact that there have been changes. So you had wider and better paved roads. You had much more development along the way, many more encroachments, and also a proper steel bridge rather than the pontoon bridge that we'd get to cross. And the nature of the shops and the eating joints also had changed, but the town square still felt the same. So it's this contradiction, I think, about the fact that there have been changes, but so much still remains the same. And I think that the other point, which I do mention in the chapter, is to speak about the domination of caste equations, at least when it comes to politics, that's still how people think in terms of, so if you ask people about what their response to some of the BJP government's flagship schemes have been, such as demonetization or even measures such as GST, the answers are so sort of drawn on caste lines, where the upper caste people will sort of have positive things to say about those measures, and the Muslims or the Dalits will have a lot of negative things to say about those measures. So that's what I find fascinating as well, that the caste equations remain very strong. And as you well know, that on candidate selection in India, caste is the starting point, and that hasn't changed in 30 years.
So, talking about or thinking about change versus continuity, one of the arguments that people have made, especially in recent years, and, I have made this argument myself, is that we're seeing more signs that good economics makes for good politics. Now, in the book, you somewhat write in a different vein that you don't seem to discern any clear relationship between economic growth and electoral outcomes. Instead, you argue that there's a sort of standard matrix of 4 or 5 issues that matter for voters in most places. What's inside of that matrix? What really matters on election day when voters go to select the person that they want to vote for?
Yeah, so first to establish, as I said, one of the most fascinating statistics I sort of dug out when we were doing the research for the book was the fact that since 1980, when we have state-level GDP data in India, there have been about 27 instances when a country's GDP growth rate has, when a state's GDP growth rate has exceeded 8% a year in any chief minister's term. And in half of those instances, the chief minister went on to lose his or her re-election bid. And that's quite sort of a shocking statement because, in countries such as America, you get very high economic growth, and that usually translates into an electoral victory for the incumbent. But in India, that hasn't happened, or at least for 50% loss is huge. Now, in terms of what really matters, I think that the most insightful comment that was given to us during our travels was this local politician we met in near Mangalore in Karnataka, UT Khadir, and he basically told us that, listen, fighting an Indian election is like passing a series of tests with a minimum passing score of 35% on each of those tests. So that both told us about how difficult it is to win an election in India, but also it got us thinking as to what are these 6 tests or so that he's talking about. He didn't specify it, but if I were to sort of spell out based on all our travels what those findings are, I would say the starting point still remains caste and community. That you got to get that correct to try and win the election in India. And the second has to do with family connections. I think it's the fact that maybe the size of the constituencies is so large, but to have name recognition which comes from the family, or given India's culture of dynastic politics, that if you come from a family which is into politics, or you already have a starting point advantage with a family connection, I think it tends to help. The third point possibly has to do with corruption, that what is the perception of you being corrupt or not being corrupt, that I think does play a role. The fourth I speak about has to do with development, that it does matter, but it's like one of those 6 factors that may matter rather than the factor that may matter, as is the case in many Western democracies. Then I think it's got to do with the money power, that clearly how much you spend does matter. But here also, as I said, that if money power alone was the winning factor, then the incumbent should always be winning elections in India, given the natural advantage they have to spend. But they're not able to sort of do that. And I think possibly the other factor got to do with welfareism, that how much have you done for the welfare of the constituency? How many schemes have you launched? What have you, done to try and help people? And so therefore there's a desire to launch one scheme after another. So I think that it's these combination of factors which possibly determine if a candidate or a party is going to win or lose an election.
So, thinking about the incumbent, obviously we have an election coming up, and I want to ask you about the present incumbent, Narendra Modi. You have had many run-ins or meetings with him over the years, and one of, I thought, the most fascinating passages in the book, you recount a meeting that your group had with then Chief Minister of Gujarat, Narendra Modi, back in 2007 when he was campaigning for re-election in Gujarat. And the meeting got very heated. Several of your colleagues were peppering Modi with questions about his involvement in the 2002 riots. And at some point, Modi decides he's had enough. He abruptly ends the session and he sort of mutters, what happened here isn't good. What did this moment sort of teach you, and maybe your other interactions teach you about Modi and his sort of leadership style?
Well, I think it basically told us about the fact that, that he's very sort of testy when, when it comes to, being questioned too much regarding the Gujarat riots. That came through also in our subsequent meetings with both Modi and Amit Shah, which is that they're very testy as far as the media is concerned, because they really feel as if the media sort of went after them unfairly after the Gujarat riots. So, and also the fact that this very deep desire to project themselves as very strong leaders. I think that is something which is also part of this entire narrative. That's what I think it really revealed to us about what's there. And also the fact that I think in Gujarat also they wanted recognition from the so-called English elite as far as the media is concerned, but also had this thing that these guys are in for us, so that sort of contradiction also I think existed back then. But I think that the two things were the fact that they really sort of felt that the media had been unfair of them, and also about the fact that they very strong desire to project themselves in a very strong way, and not somebody who, not people who will bend in the face of pressure from the media.
5 years later, in 2012, again during another Gujarat election, you had a chance to sit down with Arun Jaitley, who, of course, is the present finance minister. He spoke quite derisively about the high command culture of the Congress, and he sort of boasted about the fact that, the BJP, we're not just about one family or one leader. We have a relatively decentralized approach. Do you think that with Modi at the helm, the BJP is in danger of essentially repeating the past mistakes of the Congress Party? You grew up during Indira Gandhi's time. Do you see a potential parallel there?
Yeah, in terms of by all accounts, this is one of the most centralized prime minister's office, that has been run. And I think that is a obvious, sort of risk, because in India, as we know, that my own feeling is that the social fabric of India is such that decentralization is what sort of works better than centralization. And so that is obviously a risk as far as the BJP is concerned. But I think that what Arun Jaitley was also referring to a lot was the dynastic culture, in the Congress, and how that's something which I think that they really feel very strongly about. So I think that is something also that he was sort of alluding to as far as they're concerned. But yeah, I do feel obviously as far as even Modi is concerned, when he first came to power, it was a lot about talking about decentralization, talking about the states doing much more. But subsequently, since then, I think it's become a much more centralized prime minister's office. And so, yeah, I think that is something which we, among the many changes that we've seen not changes in terms of what we expected and how things turned out to be over the years.
You've had your own run-ins and exposure to the dynastic sort of culture of the Congress. In 2002, you recount in the book, you had a chance to sit down with both then Congress President Sonia Gandhi and her son Rahul Gandhi, who, of course, has now taken over the party. And you tried to convince them that if they were to come back to power, they really need to push for further market reforms. And you came away from that meeting quite disillusioned or disenchanted. You write in the book, quote, "Only later did I realize that I was promoting reforms that are antithetical to the Gandhi's fundamentally socialist ideology," end quote. Do you see any change in the Congress mentality, or any daylight perhaps between Sonia Gandhi and the sorts of things that her son Rahul Gandhi is talking about now?
Not really. In terms of, I feel that, as I end the book with the sort of observation that in India, every politician, especially at the center, is a statist. And I see no, I think that in terms of, if you ask me what the biggest risk to the Indian story just now is it's one of competitive populism. And I think that, like all of Rahul Gandhi's speeches as well have been much more about what more can be done, for the poor. And so I think that, like, to me, this disconnect is like always going to be there, which is the fact that India got its political freedom very early, but just didn't get enough economic freedom. And that is something which I was trying to talk to them about at that point in time. But I think that, it's this socialist statist sort of impulse is too deeply embedded in the Indian politicians' DNA. So the best we can hope for is at a state level, you get more reforms, you get more development. As you well know, that you get many more of these state delegations which come now to the U.S. to try and talk to you about investment and what they're doing for their state. So that's the best we can hope for. But I think at a central level, to get I'm just kind of free market reform, whether it's even in the odd chance that someone like Rahul sort of comes to power, I just don't think that's going to happen.
Given where we are today and where opinion surveys seem to be pointing, and of course, in light of the recent tensions between India and Pakistan, I would say, the odds are that Prime Minister Modi is likely to get a second term in office. Obviously, one can't be sure, but I would submit that's where things look today. In the book, particularly in the last section, you compare Modi to the Turkish president Erdogan. And Erdogan began as a reformer, but then he ended up as a strongman, as we all know. Is that something that you worry about if Modi comes back to power, that he essentially will follow an Erdogan-like model?
I make that sort of thing in 2014, but I think things have already played out a bit differently on a couple of levels. One, I think that the fact is that, as I said, that Erdogan in his first term was much more of an economic reformer than what we have seen as far as Modi is concerned. And secondly, I do feel that the institutions in India, for whatever it's worth, are at least somewhat stronger than as far as Turkey is concerned. So I do feel the fact that for anyone, and also the fact that it's, like in India, as I sort of conclude in the last chapter, that it's very difficult that even if Modi comes back, the fact that that he'll only ever have, or he and the BJP, their vote share is very unlikely to increase much from the 31% they got last time. So that sort of has a big impact on the way that you're able to govern and the way that you're able to sort of do things in India. Because one thing that they're already doing is to sort of as you know that that they are wisening up to the fact that coalitions and alliances really matter. So they're already giving up seats in places like Bihar and in Maharashtra to their alliance partners, because they sort of understand that with the opposition coming up with more alliances, they need to play the same game. So I just feel the diversity, the heterogeneity of India is such where it is very difficult to exactly go down that path that happened in Turkey. And so therefore, this election is, I know that, that the momentum has possibly turned in favor of the BJP following the surgical, following the airstrikes. But I think that it's still a very competitive election. And I think that that's what the difference is as far as Turkey is concerned. So, yeah, there are some shades of it in terms of the hostility towards the media, and there's enough being spoken about the undermining of the institutions. But I still feel that compared to Turkey, we've already seen a bit of a different path since I made that first analogy in 2014 in particular, when Modi came to power.
So let me just ask a final question over here. The book touches on a lot of quite sensitive and difficult themes: caste discrimination, cronyism, corruption, violence, all of which are very sort of depressing topics. But you end the book on a note of optimism, that you're fundamentally sort of bullish about Indian democracy. So can you share, with our listeners, what is it about the India story that motivates, this ultimate sense of optimism?
Yeah, so just a couple of factors here. One, as I said, that despite the, about Indian democracy in particular, what I try and sort of, say, towards the end of the book is that despite all the advantages, the fact that the voter is able to sort of, turn out their leaders at with such frequency, despite all the advantages an incumbent has in office, to me, is there's something heartwarming about that as well, because it's as you know, that once leaders come to power, they have all the trappings of power, all the sort of, people fawning over them and all the advantages of money and everything, and yet the voter is able to sort of turn, to turn the leader out when he or she sort of wants them. I think that for me just speaks volumes about the depth of Indian democracy, and something which sort of is very encouraging. And the other thing which gives me sort of optimism as far as India is, concerned also, is the fact that no matter which party or leader comes and goes, I think that as far as India is concerned, the basic growth story remains intact. That it's not as impressive as China's, which we all know is sort of in a very different league. But the fact that we're able to get 6 to 7%, type of economic growth, no matter who comes, who goes, what the shape of the government is, I think that's been the story of the last 2 or 3 decades. And sure, we got a great boom from '03 to '07, but as I've argued in my previous books, that had much to do with the fact of what was happening globally rather than what was happening at home. So yeah, there are some risks of competitive populism and other things, but in general, I feel the fact that it is the fact that the Indian growth story chugs along no matter who comes and goes. So I think these couple of factors, the power of the individual voter to exercise, his or her franchise, and of these other things, I think is what gives me optimism as far as India is concerned.
The book is titled Democracy on the Road, a 25-year journey through India. It is a fascinating journey. I highly recommend it. It's available online and in bookstores. Ruchir, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, and good luck on the campaign trail this spring. Yes,
I'm looking forward to going back on our 28th election trip once I'm able to sort of make that plan after dates are announced.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we referenced on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Jamie Hinson and Rachel Osnos. Tim Martin's our audio engineer, and Lauren Duax our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.